I'm Meredith Oglesby, and this is Valentina Castano, and we're both agricultural communication master's students at the University of Florida. And today we're going to be sharing some research we did last summer, focusing on COVID-19 vaccine videos and how college students trusted those messages from international and domestic sources. Along with Valentina and I, our team was made up of Alena, Poulin, Dr. Lauri Baker, Dr. McLeod-Morin, Olivia Doyle, and Dr. Lundy. And this research was through the Center for Public Issues Education at the University of Florida.
Thanks so much, Meredith. So throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and in past pandemics, we've seen that trust is a really important factor affecting the public's willingness to comply with voluntary preventative measures. With those that trust government organizations and public health organizations being more likely to take preventative measures such as hand washing, face mask wearing, and social distancing. In addition, in the influenza pandemic, the H1N1, we found that those who are over the age of 50 were even more likely to take preventative measures against the pandemic. And so this aligns pretty well with what we're seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic, where young adults between the ages of 18 and 25 are among have the lowest vaccination rates among all US adults. So as you can see up here, those between the ages of 18 and 25, only 62% are fully vaccinated. And when you compare that with the other numbers, those between the ages of 65 and 74 are 91% vaccinated. So this shows that there's a need to increase vaccine rates among younger groups, and implementing trust could be a way to do that. The World Health Organization has acknowledged the importance of trust when communicating preventative measures during public health crises, going so far as to say that trust is the currency for communicating health risks. So for our study, the purpose was to compare college students' levels of trust in video communications about the COVID-19 pandemic from domestic and international sources. To do this, we first determined which sources were perceived as trustworthy of COVID-19 vaccine information, and then we compared the trust between international and domestic sources to see who came out on top. So in this study, we used perception analyzers, and these are really handy because they allow researchers to collect second-by-second information while participants view some kind of stimulus, which in this case was video content. So as you can see up here, each participant has their own dial, and on that dial they can turn as they view the content. In our study, we had them determine or describe their level of trust in the content they were viewing from 0 to 100, so 0 being extremely untrustworthy and 100 being extremely trustworthy. And so as they watched that video, we had them continuously turn that dial as the content changed so we could understand how their trust changed between each video and throughout the content. Oh, sorry, to go back. No worries. So down here is an example output from a different study that used perception analyzers to understand trust in agriculture-related messages. So as you can see down there, just after the 1 minute mark, it looks like that trust went up really, really high, and then shortly after it dropped down pretty low. So this is a really nice way to see how perceptions change as we're viewing that content on a second-by-second basis.
So for the methods of this study, our sample was made up of undergraduate and graduate students at the university. We had about 54 students. So the students had to be in a space to be able to use the dials. So we brought them into one of the classrooms, and when they first came in, they took a pre-test through Qualtrics. We collected demographic information, COVID-19 knowledge, and their social media use. Then, once all the students had taken that first Qualtrics test, we started explaining the instructions, and we had somewhat of a moderator for the session that walked the students through what to expect, and we asked them throughout the entire session to be continuously turning the dial, and we actually had them do a practice video to begin, since the dials are something that most participants have never used before or were not familiar with. So we did the practice video, and then the videos were shown in a series of videos with space in between each video so we could collect the difference in the trust throughout the videos shown. Then in the last section of the test, we had them do a post-test that included source credibility questions, opinion of COVID-19 vaccines, and how that might have been impacted from the videos that were shown during their session. So there were 3 types of video sources shown throughout the session. All of these were social media videos on either TikTok or YouTube. We had domestic videos where we had an American Red Cross video and an ad council in partnership with the US CDC. And then for our international source, we had the United Nations. And for the US scientists, we had Dr. Knopf and Anna Blakeney. So then for our first objective, looking at what was most trusted, you can see up here on this left-hand side that the Ad Council in partnership with the CDC was most trusted, and the American Cross was the least trusted, with the US scientists and the United Nations falling right there in the middle. So then we ran independent sample t-tests, and at the neutral point of 50, and the CDC and the US scientists were statistically significant as trusted sources, and the UN and the Red Cross were also statistically significant, but those were as not trusted sources. So then when looking at how the US sources or domestic sources compared with the international source, we ran paired sample t-tests between the UN and the CDC, and the CDC was statistically significant as more trusted than the UN. When we ran the paired sample t-test between the UN and the US scientists were statistically significantly more trusted than the UN. And then for our last t-test that we ran between the UN and the Red Cross, there was no difference. It was not statistically significant, meaning there was no difference in trust between those two sources. So in conclusion, in this study, participants trusted the domestic sources more than that international source. And this really aligns with previous research that shows that participants are more likely to trust sources that they're closer to or more familiar with.
So in the future, we do recommend that science communicators feature scientists on platforms that college students are most familiar with, so social media or TikTok, seeing that scientists were one of the more trusted sources in our study. And we recommend that they consider creating videos that are more engaging to help explain the scientific information, again, on the platforms that college students are using, so it's more accessible to them. We recommend that agricultural and extension communicators develop campaigns related to public health and vaccines, and that messaging should focus on the sources that students are familiar with, which in the case of our study was the CDC. Finally, we know that college students are the future decision makers, and some of them may not be as familiar with extension services, so using, again, those social media platforms to reach them might be a really good way to have them become more knowledgeable of agriculture and extension as a whole. So for future research, we did not do this in our study, but we do recommend that future research determine factors that are most influential over trust, so things like message source, speaker gender, profession, and message frames. And we recommend that future research determine college students' levels of trust in health communication topics specifically, which we did not look at, from extension and agricultural related sources. And that is all we have for you today. We would love to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in and start off the questions. One question I had is, how did you determine the trusted sources that you included in the study itself?
Which ones did we decide to test?
Well, yeah, how did you make the determination of what was a trusted source that you then included for the purposes of testing it?
So the sources that we used, we chose different videos that were about the COVID-19 vaccine. So we had TikTok videos, and they were all related to the COVID-19 vaccine. And then we were able to tell if they were trusted sources based on that range from 0 to 100. So the trusted sources fell anywhere over that 50 mark. So 50 was neutral as either I don't trust, I do trust, like that's just the neutral point. So anything over 50 was what we considered the trusted source. And then that's how we ran those independent t-tests at that neutral point of 50 to see if they were statistically significant as trusted or not trusted.
Right, so if they, after the independent sample t-test, if they, of course they were all statistically significant, but if they fell over the 50, the neutral point of 50, we considered those trusted sources. And if they fell under, we considered them untrustworthy sources.
Right. But how did you determine which ones got included into the Doyle test?
Into the Doyle study?
Yeah.
I believe we just looked for videos on these platforms where these organizations were communicating directly with the public, and like there were calls to action in these videos, so they all had like, make sure you get your booster, or this is me with mine, make sure you get yours. So that's kind of how we picked those.
And we also wanted them to be the domestic sources and not one international source, which was the UN.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Is this a Dial Smith?
It is, yes.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really fun. We took this as a class last summer
Mm-hmm.
where we learned how to use the
Yeah.
dials, and then this was like part of the classes. We did a study with testing the dials, so it was really fun. Yeah.
So during the course of the pandemic, we really struggled as an industry to not only protect our workers, but to also make sure that they were protected to a point where we could continue to produce food. If you remember early, there were a lot of empty shelves across the country. We had to ensure that the food supply kept going. And a lot of that had to do with PPEs and then vaccines when those rolled in. How did you select your population for this? And it seems like there's an opportunity to work within those ag industries directly for the people that we really needed on the front lines rather than college students. So walk me through that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. As Meredith mentioned, so this was a class that we took last summer, and so this was actually our first experience using these dials. So we were kind of getting used to that process, but I agree there's greater implications here. Really the reason that we chose college students was because like we showed up here, there is a need to improve vaccine rates among this population, so we thought that would be a really great place to start, to kind of see how they work, see how we could get this all together. But there are other studies that have actually used perception dials to analyze trust in other agriculture-related messages, but there's way more things that we could do. So yes, Ashley, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I'll also add that the timing of this study was incredible because even Florida, at the University of Florida, we remember there was like 3 weeks where people were actually coming to campus, people weren't masking, there were less restrictions. And this study happened to fall within those 3 weeks, and so it was still a really difficult time to be able. One of the major limitations of this dials and the dial smith is that you really need people to physically come to you. It's different than, like you said earlier, the Qualtrics studies were a little bit easier during the pandemic, but in-person studies were not as easy. And so it really fell into the difficulty of recruiting people because we had actually, that was our first choice, was to be able to recruit a general population. So really in this case it was an ease of sampling and who we had access to, but yeah, that's a great point.
It also fell at a really interesting time, like Ashley had said. So at the University of Florida, they have the summer classes split into summer A and summer B. And during summer B, a lot of the first semester freshmen come to campus. And so we thought that there were going to be a lot of students on campus because the University of Florida was saying all the students were going to be back in person. And then when we were actually doing the study, it turned out that there actually weren't as many students on campus as we thought that there would be.
Because I believe that week that we collected data was the first week that UF said, come back to campus, classes are in session in person. So just like Meredith said, we anticipate there'd be a lot of people, but still kind of go back to normalcy.
Any other questions?
Very interesting study. I like the idea of your last slide about message frames. So considering message frames, so what do you mean by message frames? Like, is it like more cultural, political, social frame that you use within the message, right? So given that, do you think that trust is something very static or it can be very dynamic? Their trust can change over the times. Right?
Yeah, I think that's actually something that's really interesting about the dials is with that second by second collection of the data, you can see how their trust changes just throughout the video. So in the future, I think that if you were testing message frames, you would be able to see that second by second change of how the message frames change and how their trust changes at the same time.
Right.
We didn't include it in this particular study here, but part of this larger study, we actually had a video. You might remember the Ad Council had a pretty popular video in the United States that had all the living presidents, except for the current president at the time, which is President Trump. And they were actually speaking about the vaccine, and that was an incredible video because you could see a lot of changes as different presidents came onto the screen. You would see trust fall, or other presidents came onto the screen and you would see trust skyrocket. So it really was truly dynamic in the moment. So I think that political frames could be interesting, as well as thinking about fear frames. We saw a lot of that, and if you're involved in communication, that's usually not a very effective method Yet it was used a lot when communicating about the vaccine. So those would be some other frames to look
I
at.
also feel like a frame of personal threat versus community threat would be really interesting to look at, because we've seen quite a bit of that as well. But yes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they've redone that video since we did the study to actually include President Trump.
Right.
So that would be really interesting to look at if we did 2 videos and just saw how different those perceptions were.
Yeah, and then the social media is very difficult to build the trust because once it is out, you never know how the framing has
Of
changed.
course.
And that's why WHO said that we are living in infodemic. Right?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to do this study at different points in the pandemic and see how that changes over time. Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Thank
I know